because he wanted to win his noble's favour by writing off their Jewish debts. Therefore, now I'm just going to summarise what I've said, proving to the examiner I've answered the question. One reason, I'm going to condense the words from the question a little bit just to save myself some time. One reason, Jews left England by 1290 was because they were expelled by King Edward. Full stop, that is it. So I'm going to write 2 paragraphs like that, okay? Again, in this question, we are aiming for 6 minutes a paragraph. So you're going to write 2 claim paragraphs. Note, claim paragraphs this time. You're going to explain, that means. You're going to write 6 minutes per paragraph. So that means we're going to answer this question in 12 minutes. It is the same for the previous question, okay? So we're writing 2 paragraphs. That's 6 mins per paragraph. So again, in a clear and organised summary, you are also aiming for 12 mins, 12 minutes in total. With both of these questions, if you can do it in less than 12 minutes, brilliant, because you're just saving yourself time, like we said earlier, and I shouldn't have done, for question 4 and question 5. Okay? In question 4 and question 5, you are going to pick one question to answer. Do not answer 2 questions. You don't get any more marks. It's a waste of your time. I would really advise you, strongly advise you, to read both questions therefore carefully. Usually there will be one that's probably slightly harder than the other. So pick the one that A, you think is easiest, and B, you think you know the most about. Once you've picked that question, pick the one you're going to answer, you're going to bug it. Okay? Now again, this is quite simple because actually the action word here is always the same, and it is, how far do you agree with this statement? Okay? Then my keywords. So Britain's growing connections to the wider world. So I'm going to underline that. Growing connections to the wider world. So I think here this is talking about empire, right? Was the most important reason for increasing migration to Britain between 1750 to present. So actually that's talking about 2 time periods. It's talking about the industrial period, 1750 to 1900, and it's talking about the modern period, which is from 1900 to modern day. And actually, in your 18 markers on the Migrants paper, it will usually do that. It will ask you about 2 time periods. For example, if you look at the second one, well, it's talking about between 1250 and 1750. So it's talking about the medieval period. Remember, you can go back to 1066. It's circa 1250. That means around. And it goes right up to 1750, so right through the early modern period as well, okay? So these questions on the Migrants paper will usually ask you about 2 time periods, which is quite nice, actually. What I'm then going to do in this little bit of space underneath is plan my answer for this 18 marker a bit more thoroughly. Before I do that, I'm going to tell you what you need for each level. Now, I'm always going to use on one hand, on the other hand. in these paragraphs, okay? Because I know I want to give a balanced answer if I can. I want to give two sides. On one side, I agree, other people might disagree. On one hand, on the other hand. If I am aiming for a level 4 or level 5, and I don't want anybody to be aiming for less than that, then I am going to write 2 claim paragraphs using on one hand, on the other hand, but I'm also before that going to do an introduction. Your introduction is really short. It's one sentence. I agree, I disagree, I partly agree, I partly disagree with this statement because. One sentence, that is it. If I am aiming for a level 6 or level 7, then I am going to write 3 claim paragraphs and an introduction. On one hand, on the other hand, again, but I might have 2 that agree or 2 paragraphs that disagree. If I am aiming for a level 8 or a level 9, I am going to have 4 claim paragraphs an introduction and a conclusion. I'm not going to take you through how to write a claim paragraph again later on, because we've just done that on the previous question. But I am going to explain how to write an intro and a conclusion. Before I do that, I'm going to show you how I want you all to plan. And it is really, really simple and it's very quick. We're going to make ourselves a little pie chart to show how far you agree with this statement, but also to just kind of list basically the paragraphs that you are going to write. We can glance back at this. It means we are really clear always on what we're writing. So it's asking me about Britain's growing connections with the wider world. I basically think that that's referring to the empire, right? Britain's empire growing over that time was the most important reason for increasing migration. So it's asking me here about reasons why people migrated to Britain, causes. Now clearly there are a lot of migrants who arrived between that period, 1750 to present day, because of the empire. I might talk about the Lascar sailors. They come from India. I might talk about migrants like Ignatius Sancho, or Francis Barber, or Bill Richmond. They are all ex-slaves who were either freed, or ex-enslaved people, who were either freed in North America, like the case of Bill Richmond, who's freed for his for fighting in the American Revolutionary War on the side of Britain, or they are emancipated whilst they're in Britain. Emancipated means freed. Take, for example, Francis Barber and Ignatius Sancho, who are freed by their owners after they've already been transported forcibly to Britain. So there are several examples that I can use. Deen Muhammad is another one who comes from India, of people who are migrating from areas in the British Empire. So clearly that is a big reason. So for that reason, I think overall I kind of agree with this statement. So this is my agree side of my pie chart, this is my disagree side. All I'm then going to do is just split this up into my paragraphs. And again, I can think about importance of factors here, right? So first of all, I'm going to talk actually and do a paragraph, I think, on forced migration and enslavement from the empire. So right, forced migration from empire. And there are lots of examples I can talk about here. I'm going to jot a couple down just because I'm worried about forgetting them. And I'm going to write Ignatius Sancho. I could talk about Francis Barber, like we said. I could talk about Bill Richmond. Elizabeth Bell Lindsay is another one. The Lascar Sailors is another one that we've mentioned. Dean Mohammed. There are loads here. But I just want to focus on forced migration to begin with. And so I'm going to focus on people who are emancipated, enslaved people. Because I'm going to save Dean Mohammed, etc. for later on. Because then I'm going to do a paragraph on Indian migration. Or Indian migrants. And again, I'm going to jot down, well, Lascar Sailors, they come and settle, right? I'm going to jot down about Dean Mohammed. There are loads, and there are others that you can talk about as well in Indian migrants. Another group that I might talk about are Chinese migrants. They're very similar to Lascar Sailors, and they end up settling, of course, in Liverpool especially, and also in Liverpool and also in London, where in Liverpool has the oldest Chinatown in the world, and London also has a very old historic Chinatown. So that's another paragraph I could do. I'm actually, though, going to talk about Irish migration, because, of course, that is huge in the Victorian period, in the 19th century, sorry. Now, of course, that is kind of driven by the famine, but it is also driven by Britain's connection to Ireland. Ireland is part of the empire at that time, and those migrants, in part, are coming to Britain because it is part of the empire. Of course, there's more to that story. They're also coming here really because it was planned for a stop-off before they go to America, and many get stuck here. So I could also use this to disagree with this statement if I wanted to. In this case, I'm not going to. I'm going to use it to agree with this statement. So Irish migration, and I could talk about Irish migrants in Liverpool if I wanted a specific example. I could talk about the navvies coming to Britain for work. Again, though, it's because of the link, right? Because all of these nations are countries that are in the empire, or colonies rather, that are in the empire. So all of this is my agree side. Now, I'm aiming for a level 9, so I want 4 paragraphs. And on my disagree side, I'm only going to write 1 paragraph actually, because I want to kind of form an argument that shows why I agree mainly. But on my disagree side, well, I'm going to talk about persecution. And I think I could talk about the persecution of Ashkenazi Jews. Now, mainly that happens in the Russian Empire, which at that time comprised lots of countries, including today Ukraine and Poland, or parts of those countries, not necessarily all. But that includes a couple of countries, and it's worth being aware of that at that time. Ashkenazi Jews mainly lived in an area of Russia called the Pale, which is on the western edge of Russia today, which is now in Poland, lots of it. And they were being persecuted both by the Tsar, by the government, and also just generally by people, other Russian people living in the Pale at that time. So as a result, many Ashkenazi Jews flee the Russian Empire, and lots of those come to Britain. And of course, they set up really quite important and vibrant communities in the East End of London, especially. We've spoken about the tailoring and the sweatshops and things that are set up there. Well, that's all part of Ashkenazi Jewish migration. And so I think I can use them as an example of how actually there are other things driving migration too, beyond just connections to Britain through Britain's empire. Because these migrants are fleeing their homeland, or certainly where they were living at the time, not necessarily their homeland, but they're fleeing where they're living at the time due to persecution. So that's going to be my fourth and final paragraph. Okay, so I've got this now that I can keep referring back to. Like I've said, I'm not going to write a full paragraph for you because we've already done or seen a claim paragraph, but I am going to show you what this might look like if you're writing an introduction and a conclusion. So the first thing, as always, and it's even more important with this question, is that I write question 4 up here in the side. I'm really clear about which question I'm answering. Now, introduction is really simple. I'm going to use the words from the question and I'm going to show or say how far I agree. You might use a word from the vocab map to help you with this, to give that extra kind of je ne sais quoi to your answer, I suppose. And I'm going to say, overall, I largely agree with this view. That Britain's growing connections with the wider world have been the most important reason for increasing migration to Britain. Full stop. That's all that I need you to write for your introduction. That is all you need to say. Really, you probably want to take a maximum of 1 or maybe even absolute tops 2 minutes to write that. Be as quick as you can. In your conclusion, you remember you only actually need a conclusion if you're shooting for a level 9. If you're not shooting for a level 9, don't worry about it. Just don't include one. And really, all you're doing is summarising your argument. Now, the first golden rule for a conclusion is never introduce anything new. You're summarising what you've already said. So it's really going to feel very, very similar to your introduction. Okay? Here we go. In conclusion. Sorry, that's the end of break. In conclusion, I largely agree with this view. Now, I'm not going to write out here all of the question like I did in my introduction. And the reason for that is, that's just going to take me too much time. And I'm not going to have time in the exam if I'm writing 4 paragraphs to do all of that again. Okay? It's about largely wrong. So leave it at that. In conclusion, I largely agree with this view because clearly Britain's empire, how we were connected to the wider world, was a crucial driver. I'm using words from the vocab map that help me to kind of explain causes here. It was a crucial cause. It was a driver. It drove forward people wanting or people migrating to Britain. It was a crucial driver for migration to Britain. Full stop. Now you're going to write all of this as one paragraph. I'm going to split this up a bit so you can see it a bit easier, because I know my handwriting is not great. But next comes our although statement. Although there were other drivers for migration, such as the Russian persecution of Ashkenazi Jews, And then here comes the second part of that although statement. In many ways, greater numbers of migrants arrived from the British Empire full stop. Then comes the fact that. The fact that migrants from colonies, including India, Ireland, and the Caribbean, arrived in abundance. That means there were lots of them. Shows that. So we'll use the statements, the fact that, shows that, Britain's connections, remember apostrophe for Britons, it's possessive over the connections, it belongs to it grammatically. Britain's connections to the wider world was a more significant driver for migration. Full stop. And that's it. So as you can see there, and that's, if you're not late, if you weren't into lessons, you're late. So as you can see, they're quite lengthy paragraphs, but in your conclusion, you really are only going to write 3 paragraphs, and that's it. In conclusion, I largely agree with this view because clearly Britain, that's spelt wrong. In conclusion, I largely agree with this view because clearly Britain's empire, how we were connected to the wider world, was a crucial driver for migration to Britain. Although there were other drivers for migration, such as the Russian persecution of Ashkenazi Jews, in many ways greater numbers of migrants arrived from the British Empire. The fact that migrants from colonies including India, Ireland and the Caribbean arrived in abundance shows that Britain's connections to the wider world was a more significant driver for migration. Okay, so 3 lengthy paragraphs, but really, or sentences, but really that is it. The sentence starters you need to remember, therefore, are in conclusion, although, in many ways, the fact that, and shows that. Okay, that's what I need you to remember. And that, for the Migrants paper, is it, actually. So, what about Normans? Well, let's go and talk about that now. All right, next question is a source question, okay? In fact, a lot of the questions on the Normans paper are source questions. And you will see that this question is worth 3 minutes. In fact, for all of the questions on the Normans paper, you're going to aim for a mark a minute. So 3 marks, 3 minutes. The next question is worth 5 marks, 5 marks, 5 minutes. Question after that is worth 12 marks, 12 marks, 12 minutes. It's only when you get onto the final question, which is another how far do you agree with this view question, that we're going to alter that, okay? In fact, I should have told you actually, on the last question, let's go back to that very quickly. On the last question, the how far do you agree question, you are going to aim for 28 minutes. So you're still shooting for 6 minutes a paragraph, And that should give you time for most of you, unless you're aiming for a level 9, to spend 6 minutes, to spend 28 minutes answering this, so 6 minutes per paragraph. If you're aiming for a level 9, you're going to have to write your paragraphs a bit quicker. So if you're aiming for a level 9, I would shoot for 5 minutes per paragraph. All right, let's move on for reals this time. Right, Norman's questions. You want to aim for 3 minutes because it's worth 3 marks. And the first question is really easy. It's going to ask you something like this. In interpretation A, it will always say interpretation. In interpretation A, the artist Frank Wilkins shows William as the rightful King of England. Identify and explain one way which he does this. It's going to give you some provenance. This is the provenance. It's the information about the source. Where has it come from? What is it? Interpretation A, an 1820 painting by the British artist Frank Wilkins showing William's victory at the Battle of Hastings. The Pope is shown on a horse to the right of William. Here he is. You can't see that very well, can you actually? Never mind. We'll just have to use this pencil for now. So this question is really simple. Do not overthink it. Do not spend much time on it at all. I'm just looking for one way that this picture, and it will usually be a picture, shows William is the rightful King of England. I think this is really easy. This one was a gift because William is wearing a crown. That tells us that these people think he's the rightful King of England, right? Easy. Keep it simple. I'm going to go to my question paper. This is question 6A. So I'm going to write 6A in my margin, and then I'm just going to start to answer it. You only need to write 2 sentences. You're going to write not very much at all, because we're only going to spend 3 minutes, and we've already spent 30 seconds reading the question and circling something in the picture. So now I've got 2.5 minutes, maybe even 2 minutes. Here's what I'm going to write. Really simple. One way. Interpretation A shows William to be the rightful King of England. William is wearing a crown. Full stop. Second sentence. This suggests William is the rightful king because a crown is a symbol of monarchs and kings. It suggests, or you could say it tells us, William is King of England. Full stop. I reckon that took me about 1.5 minutes. Done. That's all I need to write. Move on. Right. Question 6B. Question 6B is a little bit weird, actually. But I think it's still quite an easy question. It's worth 5 marks, so we're going to spend absolute maximum 5 minutes. Let's jot that down quickly, just as a reminder. 5 minutes on this one. 3 minutes on this one. Both of them, we're only going to write really 1 paragraph, and it's going to ask us something that we want to follow up. If you were asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, this picture again, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us to analyse and understand William's victory in the Battle of Hastings. Right, I'm going to underline that bit because that's actually really important, and I've got to make sure that I link my answer back to that if I want to get the full 5 marks. If I don't, I'm going to limit myself to 2, maybe 3 marks if I'm lucky. Okay? So, I sometimes find, if you're struggling with this, the easiest way to think about this question is, what does the picture not tell you? And it's, what does the picture not tell you about William's victory in the Battle of Hastings? Now, I know, for example, that a really important tactic for William was cavalry, was people riding horses. But this doesn't really tell me why that was so important or why that helped William to win the battle. For example, I know from my own knowledge about the fake retreats. I know that the Saxons didn't really have any cavalry, certainly didn't use horses in battle, or in that battle anyway. So, it doesn't necessarily tell me that. So that's something I want to investigate further. The first step in this is you're going to underline something in the provenance that you're going to follow up, or, as I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to circle something in the picture that I'm going to describe. Say if I wanted to find out about the Pope, though, and how that helped William in his victory of the Battle of Hastings. Well, in that case, I would just underline this, right? The Pope is shown on a horse to the right of William. And that's the quote that I'm going to copy down in my answer. I'm going to describe when I'm going to describe this horse, okay? Right, 5 minutes, super quick. I'm going to go to my answer booklet. I'm going to write 6B in the margin, and then I'm going to make a start. I would investigate. Now, if I was using a quote, I would now just copy down this quote, literally just copy it in quotation marks. The Pope is shown on a horse to the right of William. Full stop. That's all I do. There isn't that, so I'm just going to describe it. Think like you're too old for this, but there was a catchphrase in the 90s. Ray Walkin used to say what you see. Well, I'm just going to say what I see, okay? So I would investigate the white horse which William is riding, and the other Normans' horses. Remember, apostrophe for Normans, because the horses belong to the Normans. Normans in this sentence grammatically are possessive over the horses. Full stop. That is it. Don't need to say much. This would enable me to understand right, what is it going to enable me to understand? Well, if I think about this picture, that's going to help me to understand the role that cavalry played in the Battle of Hastings. All right? That's all I'm going to say. This would enable me to understand the role that horses and cavalry soldiers. Cavalry is a good way of saying soldiers who fight on the back of a horse. Played in the Battle of Hastings. Right, I'm going to take this one level deeper, which would also help me to understand whether cavalry helped William win the battle and how significant they were for victory. Full stop, that is it. That's all you need to say. 5 marks, in and out, done. Move on to question 7, which is another mark a minute question, as we said earlier. Question 7 is worth, though, quite a lot of marks. It's worth 12 marks, 12 marks, 12 minutes. All right, that is the absolute maximum that you are allowed to spend on this question. 12 marks, 12 minutes. All right, this is again going to ask me about interpretations, but this time it's going to ask me about two different ones, okay? Interpretations B and C are both accounts of the impact of the Norman Conquest on English society. So I'll just start to underline a few things in here, keywords that I want to know. They're accounts, okay, that's interesting. So they're written by their historians, so I know they're not going to be from the time. The impact of the Norman Conquest on English society. So I think this is going to be about change, right? This is telling me if it's impact, well, they've changed something. They've impacted England through the Norman Conquest, through the Normans taking over. But it's also asking me, here are my action words, how far do they differ? So how are they different? And what might explain differences? What might explain any differences? Those two bits are really important. So they could be different or similar, right? They're usually going to be different there, if I'm honest. Why are they different? What explains this? Okay. So the first step, like before, is to read the provenance and the sources, really the provenance and the interpretations, and establish what is different. Right, well, interpretation B, this one's from David Howarth. We've met him before. He's writing in 1977, and it's written to be a popular history. What that means is this is written for everyone, right? Now it says, a huge disruption of village life was to come. Ulfa, the Thane, had gone, either killed in battle or put in prison or degraded to the status of a cottager. That means a farmer, okay? Remember, Thane, we spell this when we've done it, we've spelt it like this. That's an Anglo-Saxon landowner, yeah? And a new master came riding up into the village and installed himself in the house of the Thane. His name was Ranulph. He, I reckon, is a Norman, so I'm going to jot down here that he's a Norman. I'm already thinking that this is talking about Norman land ownership and explaining how Anglo-Saxon landowners, thanes, carls and earls have been replaced with Norman landowners. I reckon Ranulph is one of those. Ulfa may have been a good thane or a bad thane, a kind man or a mean one, but at least he was English. He spoke the same language as the villagers. Ranulph, this upstart foreigner, wow, that's an interesting statement, lording it over a tiny place like Horsted, is the measure of England's degradation. Wow, that's quite interesting. So I'm going to underline a couple of things here, maybe some different quotes that I might use. So I'm going to say, Ulfa the Thane had gone, either killed in battle or put in prison or degraded to the status of a cottager. A new master came riding into the village, installed himself in the house of the Thane. Okay, I might not use all of those, but I'm just underlining a couple of things that I can use in my answer, okay? Because I'm going to have to say what I think this interpretation says. Now, clearly it says that the impact of Normans on English society was quite bad. It was quite negative. And that also it's a change in land ownership. So the landowners have changed from Anglo-Saxons to Normans. I'm just going to jot that down to remind myself. So it is a negative impact, and this is talking about change in land ownership. That's useful for me later on. Just reminding myself, helping out my future self. All right, let's go and look at interpretation C. Now this one is obviously a lot more recent because it's on the internet. Didn't have internet in 1977. It's written for children, but it tries to make the history not too simplistic and wants to keep children up to date with new ideas about the past. That's interesting. Right, let's have a go at this one then. Arguably, the greatest effect of the Norman Conquest was felt by the Anglo-Saxon nobility. So the biggest impact was on Anglo-Saxon nobility. Now, that's like important Anglo-Saxons. So we're thinking here thanes or earls, okay? The most powerful people in society. At the start of William's reign, many Anglo-Saxons remained in positions of power. But by the time the Domesday Book was completed in 1086, there was scarcely a noble of English descent in England. That's interesting. So it's talking about land ownership again, isn't it? Scarcely a noble of English descent in England. The effects of the conquest were not limited to aristocracy, and considerable changes were experienced by the lower levels of society. Slavery was big business in Anglo-Saxon England, with slaves accounting for between 10% and 30% of the population. As conqueror, William issued a ban on the export of slaves. That's interesting. I'm going to underline that. And while not immediately or wholly effective, its impact is evident in the Domesday Book. Their numbers in places such as Essex reduced by 25% between 1066 and 1086. Now I think this is very interesting because I could do similarity or difference here. Because if I look at the first part, well, this is actually quite similar to the interpretation B, because they're also talking about changes in land ownership. Okay, so I could do an answer about how they're actually quite similar and talking about the same thing. But I think later on, this is talking about a positive effect, isn't it, of the Norman conquest, and how actually that the Normans eradicated slavery. So I'm going to write positive impact. And I'm going to write eradicated or got rid of slavery. I'm just helping myself out later on again so I know what I'm going to write about. And I think that's what I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on that as my difference. Okay? Right, now I go to my answer. Now again, like I've said every time, I'm going to start by writing 7 in the margin so it's clear what I'm answering. You must do that or the examiner might not mark it. And then I'm going to start to write. Interpretation B claims, that word's really useful for me, the impact of the